Today, I'm going to be reviewing Dungeons 4, but Dungeons 4 is a game which shouldn't be taken too seriously, and as a result, you should also take a little bit of a commentary in this review as lighthearted and tongue-in-cheek fun, rather than a serious statement of fact. In fact, some of the things I'm going to say are references to dialogue within the game, so do take it with a grain of salt, especially if you haven't decided to dive in and try it for yourself. Now, I first encountered Dungeons 4 by playing the demo as part of Steam Next, and I have to say, it was really impressive how much of the entire game translated into that demo, to the point where after I'd played the demo, I knew I was definitely interested. But sometimes you play a demo, you're interested in a game, and the final version turns out to be something you didn't quite expect, that there's so much more to it or it evolves in different ways. And with Dungeons 4, no, not at all, and I mean that in the best possible sense. What you see is what you get, and the game lays itself out right on the box with the demo. So I very much appreciated the great presentation there. Also, I'd never played a hybrid dungeon defense game before, especially not one where you're playing as the bad guys. The closest I had was a dungeon game that Jagex had on their web game site, and I very vaguely remember it. Unfortunately, I don't think the site FunOrb still exists, so I can't go check. Either way, you're playing as the penultimate evil out to defeat the armies of good. And so you begin by cultivating and expanding your dungeon. A big part of this is research, which allows you to upgrade buildings, build new types of buildings, and increase the units in your army. But remember, the dungeon heart is, well, the heart of a dungeon, so if you lose that, the game is over, and many an incompetent evil has in fact suffered that fate. Not us, though. We are quite powerful indeed. You even have your General Talia, sometimes, when she's not busy being a damsel in distress, or at the very least a damsel who is kidnapped and is then ready to distress anything around her. Now, there are a variety of rooms which either store or produce resources. Your treasury stores gold, obtained from mining ore veins. Your vault stores evilness, obtained from murder, torture, and all other manner of evil deeds, like slapping your workers, because, after all, there's no OSHA here. Oh, and don't mind the cave-ins. Is that a leg stick? It's fine. You know what? Just let's move on. There are also production buildings, like the Gobbler Farm. Your Horde and Demon units love to gobble these chicken-like objects up, so be sure to produce enough of them. And you can even make more useful things, like the raw materials needed to make deadly traps. Oh, and also those spears that Talia keeps banging on about. You see, the heroes of good have this unfortunate habit of wandering into your dungeon, and they seem to be a little bit confused, because they don't realize that you are the supreme evil, and they should be running away from you, or at the very least, crawling in terror. But instead, they think they can actually invade your dungeon. The nerve. I mean, I know. People just have no respect these days. And so, you might want a few traps. I mean, a man-sized mousetrap isn't exactly the most practical thing. So instead, why not a pit of slime? They won't really be able to move around very much. Or some spikes if you prefer. Perforate their feet and all that. Or this giant hamster wheel contraption that is piloted by a snot. As a note, there were numerous little snots who were seriously injured and killed in the making of this video, and no, we are not responsible. Don't worry, we also killed their families to prevent them from suing. And so that's the basics of building and defending your dungeon. However, you will eventually want a little bit more. You'll want to venture into the overworld and take the fight to the heroes. And to do that, you'll need units. And to get those, you need to invest in one of the game's 3 factions. First, there's the Horde faction, full of blood and thunder. Horde units are only mortal, so they can be killed, but a quick zap from the defibrillator will bring them back. Though this is a fairly late game research that you don't get in the first campaign missions. They require a place to sleep, a steady supply of gobblers, and at least they're not a super expensive unit because they do tend to die quite a bit early on. If you fail to meet any of your unit's needs, they will start to get very angry at you, and if they get angry enough, they might even go on strike. However, workers don't really need rights here, and realistically, instead of satisfying their needs, you could always just kill them off and replace them with a different faction who's more likely to work for less. Maybe keep some of those Horde buildings around for making potions, which can be thrown on your units for a temporary buff, and get rid of those picky Hordes themselves in favor of some demons. Because demons offer a variety of high-damage ranged units, including the Seductive Succubus, one of the most useful units in the game as her pacify ability prevents enemies from fighting back. They also give you access to powerful spells, like shields to protect your unit's health, or just the ability to rain meteors on your foes, because who doesn't want to do that? The higher level your faction, the more buildings you unlock, and the higher the level cap of your units. But keep in mind, the higher level units have more needs. So a basic demon just needs some food. But as they level up, they'll want a mana bath occasionally to relax, which, okay, I guess I can understand. And then eventually, they'll need a torture chamber, because murdering and killing all day is pretty frustrating work and you need to relieve that somehow. As it turns out, the best way to do that is by, well, war crimes. It's also the perfect place to stick any pesky heroes who wandered into your dungeon. And if you don't want to get stuck in a torture chamber, then you should probably leave a like on this video since you've been here for over 5 minutes at this point. Oh, and maybe get subscribed to see what other games I'm reviewing in the future. Now, the last very fun thing about the demonic faction, which unlocks very close to the end of the campaign, is the ability to limit break, leveling up your units past the cap normally imposed by the faction. And this is why the demonic faction is my favorite. But last and certainly not least, there's the undead. By nature, they cannot be killed, so they simply resurrect at the graveyard. Unfortunately, if they have no grave, they won't resurrect and you'll be very sad, because undead units are far more expensive than their demonic or horde counterparts, with gold costs that are double or even triple the other factions. However, this comes with a nice bonus. They can consume blight to summon undead minions, so you're really getting 2, 3, or even 4 for the price of 1. Investing into this faction also gives you the ability to resurrect fallen heroes as ghosts to fight alongside your army. The undead won't be the fastest faction to progress, that belongs to the horde, but they are in it for the long haul and have some of the most powerful armies in the game. Now personally, I found it rather difficult to maintain research for multiple factions, especially on the higher difficulties. Most units become far more powerful as you max out their own personal research, which means you need a lot of gold and evilness to max out your faction. Now I did spend a lot of time killing the beings of good. Things like a unicorn that just shouldn't exist on the earth, therefore I killed that abomination. Unfortunately, even with all the evilness it granted, most of the time I felt like I should go either mono demon or mono undead, depending on how much pressure the game put on me early. And so let's recap quickly. You begin by building up your dungeon rooms. The early game consists of managing your economy while dealing with waves of attacking heroes. The game has a 20 mission campaign, which honestly is probably 1 mission too long, but it does make for a nice round number. The scenarios begin very simply. You're limited to 1 faction, and you can only do a few very basic objectives. But they end up getting rather complicated, doing things like manipulating special artifacts to bounce lasers back into a resurrected, pseudo-godlike paladin being's eyes, or collecting the Stones of Finitude, which are exactly what you thought, but the opposite. You also end up unlocking all 3 factions, gaining additional buildings, and adding quite a bit of complexity. It's not quite Age of Empires 2 or any super serious RTS levels of micro, where you need to min-max your early game to win, but it does get difficult to the point where I failed a few missions and had to go back and try them again. In the later levels, you especially have to be aware of digging too deep too early, as the dungeon can lead to some unwelcome discoveries like new enemies, or welcome ones like resource, treasures, or powerful artifacts. But after your dungeon is armed to the teeth and teeming with demons, you're going to need some heroes to murder. And if they won't come to you, it's time to take the fight to them, out in the overworld. Destroy hero camps and spread evil across the land in a bloody swath. This very often helps you complete the mission's objective. Now, occasionally the heroes will try to send construction camps or other objectives, but don't worry, those are just nice sources of evilness, especially when they contain innocent civilians. Unfortunately, the overworld controls are one of my few complaints about the game. Sometimes I struggled to highlight all my units or command them properly. This often resulted in me death dotting my forces up and just slowly sweeping across the entire area, annihilating everything in my path. I could use different unit groups, but again, sometimes the controls just didn't work the way I hoped they would, and the enemies kind of went everywhere. So a little bit more overworld control or outright formations would have definitely made it easier to split off groups and given me better micro. I understand why, in the dungeon itself, you don't have much option for micro. The units kind of just do what they want, and your only option is picking them up and literally throwing them at your foes, or alternatively, slapping foes to mark them as the target to kill. As you progress with the various missions, you also get a fun series of skills, including a wide variety of perks to customize your playstyle. I kind of see these as a couple different categories. The first category is you should just probably always use it if you're playing those factions. That's the faction-specific perks. Then there's the playstyle ones, such as making traps far cheaper. I like this one as I don't like spending a ton on my trap infrastructure, but there's definitely an argument to be made for simply mining more gold. And then a few which are more flavor than substance, such as some of Italia bonuses. While she is a very powerful unit and indeed your general, She's certainly not make or break, and I found that the overall global dungeon bonuses were more impactful. Now, another treat for anyone who plays this game is the narrator. Sure, a lot of the dialogue between the characters is cliché, and many of the characters, especially both Talia and her half-brother Tristan, are annoying, and quite frankly, I don't think the narrator was paid enough to put up with them. Thankfully, he's well aware of this, and happy to inform you at every moment precisely how annoyed he is with their chattering. And he adds a nice air of levity to what otherwise might be serious or even horrifying moments, often turning them into tongue-in-cheek fourth wall breaks. If you've played the Stanley Parable, the narration might even sound familiar.
Getting the absolute evil back on its feet was a lot easier than I thought. As I see it, the campaign won't be needing the promised 20 levels, but can actually end after the next map. Wonderful. Then I can treat myself to a nice, relaxing bath in unicorn blood.
Talia seemed very certain of victory, perhaps too certain of victory. It was negligent to believe that this story would already come to an end after such a brief intermezzo.
But then that begs the question, why are we murdering everyone? Well, simply put, because the heroes of good won't just kill themselves for us if we sit around. Well, okay, maybe they would if they had to listen to Tristan's speeches for long enough, but that takes way too long. The goal for much of the early game is to smack Talia's half-brother Tristan and his do-gooders a good 6 feet under, then put their heads on spears for good measure. As the story unfolds, across a variety of dungeons and multiple scenarios, it culminates in a fight to destroy the resurrected Thanos, which the story told me was an important character from past games. Unfortunately, because I haven't played any of the prior games, I just wanted to kill him so that his goons would stop messing with my beautiful, well-organized dungeon design by forcing me to make more trap mazes. And that's the brilliance of Dungeons 4. At the end of the day, you don't really need a reason. The game is fun for its own sake, even if you're not that invested in the story. And the narrator's quips make it very easy to enjoy it on a moment-to-moment basis, even if you come down and happen to review the game over a month after you bought it and originally basically beat it because you were busy with other things. Yeah, sorry about that. Now, I've played Dungeons 4 for over 50 hours. I definitely got my money's worth, and I've absolutely enjoyed the game. And a majority of my playtime was spent within the campaign. But there was one mission that I absolutely couldn't stand. That was the Drill of Finitude, because this mission puts you in a tough position. The dwarves are very well entrenched, and you have to stop their damned infernal drill. Unfortunately, every time the drill activates, it spends quite a bit of time disturbing the underground, which means more enemies spawn. And when more enemies spawn, they attack you. And the whole thing messes up my dungeon because the spawners aren't where I place my traps, and my traps aren't where the new enemies spawned. And it just made that mission feel like a massive slog. The story begins well. It ends well. And honestly is pretty good in the middle too. But darn those meddling devs for putting in just one extra mission to pad out that playtime and reach exactly 20 just because they promised to, because the last game had 20. Needless to say, when it comes to the Drill of Finitude, I would have been perfectly fine with a 19-mission campaign. However, a lot of the bonus missions in skirmish mode more than make up for it, as some of them are quite fun, especially the one where you're defeating a bunch of waves of enemies and desperately trying to survive. So if you like quippy dialogue, or you just want a really solid dungeon defense game, I can absolutely recommend Dungeons 4. Now, Dungeons 4 was the first Dungeons defense game that I've played. And it's certainly not going to be the last. In fact, I'm definitely going to go back and play Dungeons 3 at some point in the near future. I'm sure the gameplay is going to still be solid and engaging, but even if it isn't as good, then it's going to be well worth it just to hear what the narrator thinks of more of the characters. And also maybe to see how we got into this whole situation with Talia, Tristan, and Thanos, because they sound like they have some family issues and should probably get counseling. Except I'm pretty sure that Talia murdered all the counselors, and if she didn't, then Thanos definitely did, because he might consider himself the supreme force of good, because, that's what you do when you're practically the incarnation of good. And so with that, I'm curious, does Dungeons 4 look up your alley, and what are some other games that you've played which are similar to this? Be sure to leave them down below, and who knows, maybe I'll review them or talk about them in a future video. And if you're looking for something else to watch, maybe check out my first impressions of a game, where I went over the demo, gave my thoughts then without having played very much of it, and you can come back and compare to how my opinions matured after having played through the entire thing. Before I go, I'd like to take a moment to thank my patrons and channel members for the continued support. For as low as $1 a month, you can help make videos just like this one possible. Link to support is of course down below. With that said, thanks for watching to the end. Remember, if any of your snot steps out of line, give them a good old smack, and I'll see you again sometime soon.